I'm calling 911. She refuses to join our HOA. Our neighbor Karen actually called the police because my wife said no to joining the homeowners association. Think about that for a second. Calling emergency services because someone declined HOA membership. The officer showed up looking absolutely baffled by this complaint. When he asked for my wife's identification, Karen stood there with this smug smile, probably thinking she'd won some kind of victory. But the moment the cops saw my wife's credentials, everything changed. Karen's confident expression vanished instantly. What happened next shocked our entire neighborhood. Drop a comment where you're watching from. Let me paint you a picture of Belinda Johnson. And yes, that's her real name because what happens next is a matter of public record. 54 years old, HOA president for the past decade, and someone who clearly thought a laminated badge from Office Depot gave her the same authority as a federal judge. She introduced herself with this rehearsed speech about community standards and property value protection. But here's what caught my attention. Every few seconds she'd glance back at her house like she was expecting the FBI to come bursting out of her bushes. My wife, Julia, being the observant Navy logistics officer that she is, immediately started taking mental notes. Me, I was just trying not to laugh at this whole theatrical performance happening on our front lawn because, honestly, it felt like community theater gone horribly wrong. Now, here's where things get legally interesting, and trust me, this is important for understanding just how manipulative Belinda really was. Our property sits technically within the HOA boundaries. That part was completely true. But here's the kicker. The previous owner had died before signing the updated 2019 covenant with all these new ridiculous rules that nobody had voted on. So, we're stuck in this legal gray area where we're sort of in the HOA, but not bound by their latest power trip regulations that Belinda had apparently invented during a wine-fueled weekend of suburban tyranny. Belinda, being the manipulative genius she thought she was, decided to exploit this confusion like a lawyer who'd learned everything from late-night TV commercials. State law requires HOA compliance, she declared, waving around some papers that looked like they had been printed 5 minutes ago. Daily $100 fines until you sign the updated covenant. The audacity was absolutely breathtaking. Really, who does that? Who walks up to strangers and demands they sign legal documents because you said so? And then, and this is where it gets really good, she starts citing Municipal Code 47.3.2b like she's reading from some official government handbook. Spoiler alert, that code doesn't exist. She literally made it up on the spot, probably figuring that military families are too dumb to fact-check suburban legal nonsense. Now, let me tell you about my wife, Julia, because understanding her background is crucial to everything that happens next. This woman has dealt with actual military bureaucracy, the kind that makes civilian red tape look like children's coloring books. She's navigated Navy logistics nightmares that would make a normal person curl up in a corner and cry. She's got federal contractor clearance that requires more background checks than most people get in their entire lives. So when some suburban wannabe dictator shows up with fake legal threats and made-up municipal codes, Julia's military training kicks into high gear faster than you can say court-martial. And instead of telling Belinda where she could shove her clipboard, which is absolutely what I wanted to do, Julia just smiled with that terrifying military politeness that means someone's about to get professionally destroyed. I'll need to review the actual legal requirements first, she said in that calm, measured tone that she uses when she's about to systematically dismantle someone's entire argument. Could you provide the specific statute citations and the legal authority for these daily fines? Watching Belinda's confident facade crack in real time was like watching someone realize they'd brought a water pistol to a gunfight with a Navy SEAL. But Belinda wasn't ready to surrender her imaginary authority just yet. Oh no, this woman doubled down harder than a Vegas gambler with a mortgage payment due. Within exactly 63 minutes of our conversation, and I know it was 63 minutes because Julia timed it, we had a hand-delivered violation notice sitting on our doorstep. The offense: unauthorized vehicle display for having military license plates on our car. I'm not making this up. This woman actually wrote us a ticket for having government-issued license plates on a vehicle that was legally parked in our own driveway. The violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. She cited the same non-existent Municipal Code 47.3.2b, claimed we were in violation of community aesthetic standards, and demanded immediate compliance or face escalating enforcement measures. Julia photographed everything, time-stamped it, and started building what she called the documentation trail. Meanwhile, I'm standing there thinking we should just sign the stupid covenant and avoid the drama. Thank God I married someone smarter than me, because Julia saw this for exactly what it was: a systematic intimidation campaign designed to crush anyone who dared question Belinda's self-appointed authority. That evening, our neighbor, Mrs. Carter, a 70-something retired accountant with more common sense than the rest of the subdivision combined, came over with some coffee and some very interesting observations. "She's never been this aggressive before," Mrs. Carter told us, settling into our kitchen chairs like she was about to share state secrets. "Something's got her spooked. In all my years here, I've never seen Belinda this desperate to force someone out." When we asked what she meant by force someone out, Mrs. Carter's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering before a tornado. "3 families in the past 2 years," she said quietly. "All of them asked questions about HOA finances. All of them suddenly decided to move after dealing with Belinda's harassment campaigns." That's when the light bulb went off in my head, and I realized we weren't dealing with some power-hungry suburbanite having a bad week. This was systematic. This was calculated. This was someone who had perfected the art of using fake authority to terrorize people into silence. And we'd just become her latest targets. But here's what Belinda hadn't counted on. Military families don't scare easily, and we definitely don't back down from bullies who think paperwork makes them invincible. The next morning brought an escalation that even I couldn't ignore anymore. Belinda cornered Julia at the mailbox with what she probably thought was her most intimidating performance of community leadership. "I've been running this community for 10 years, she declared, her voice rising with each word like a kettle reaching full boil. "I've destroyed families who thought they could cross me. You military people always think rules don't apply to you, but this community has ways of handling non-compliance." The threat was clear, direct, and absolutely the wrong thing to say to someone who'd spent years dealing with actual dangerous situations overseas. Julia, maintaining that infuriating military calm that makes me both proud and slightly afraid of my wife, simply responded, "Ma'am, I've faced actual threats overseas. Your paperwork doesn't intimidate me." That's when my protective husband instincts kicked in, because watching someone threaten my wife tends to bring out my less diplomatic side. "Try threatening her again," I told Belinda, probably with more heat than Julia would have preferred, "and see what happens." The look on Belinda's face was priceless, like she just realized she'd been barking at a sleeping bear. But here's where things took a turn that should have been our first real warning that we were dealing with someone much more dangerous than your average HOA tyrant. Instead of backing down or trying to de-escalate the situation like a normal human being, Belinda immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right there in front of us. "Emergency," we could hear her saying, her voice suddenly switching to this victim tone that would have been Academy Award worthy if it wasn't so obviously fake. "I need the police immediately. The military family is making threats and harassment. They're being aggressive and intimidating." The whole performance was so over the top that I almost wanted to applaud. But as Marcus watched her through our window afterward, something didn't add up. Why is she smiling while reporting a threat? That moment of seeing her genuine satisfaction while making a false police report was when we both realized this neighborhood drama was going to get much worse before it got better. The next morning, I'm sitting at my kitchen table trying to convince myself that maybe Belinda's police call was just empty posturing when I look out the window and see a squad car pulling into our driveway. My stomach dropped faster than a rock off a cliff. Look, when you're a military family, even false police reports can absolutely destroy your career. Security clearances, federal contractor positions, Navy logistics assignments, they all vanish the moment you get tagged as a problem person in some police database. Julia was putting on her professional face, but I could see the worry lines around her eyes. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was potentially career-ending stuff that could follow us for decades. Officer Tyler stepped out of his cruiser with that serious cop expression that immediately tells you this isn't a social visit. You know the look, all business, clipboard ready, the kind of professional demeanor that makes you automatically start reviewing everything you've done in the past week to make sure you haven't accidentally committed any crimes. Meanwhile, Belinda had positioned herself at her front window like she was watching her personal victory parade. I swear I could practically see her vibrating with anticipation from across the yard. She'd probably already started planning her "I told you so" speech to the neighbors and maybe even practiced her testimony for whatever charges she thought we were about to face. Tyler approached our door with standard police professionalism, asking the usual questions about reported threats and harassment while taking notes on his official pad. But here's where Belinda made her first tactical error. She couldn't resist trying to control the narrative from her yard. "They think military service makes them special," she shouted across the distance, her voice carrying that particular suburban shrillness that makes dogs howl. "They're trying to intimidate the entire community with their federal connections." Every 30 seconds, it was something new. "Officer, I'm the HOA president. They're violating community standards. This is exactly the kind of aggressive behavior I was warning you about." Her voice kept getting higher and more frantic with each interruption, like a balloon being slowly inflated until it's ready to pop. Tyler, to his credit, maintained professional courtesy while clearly getting annoyed with Belinda's attempts to coach his investigation from the sidelines. You could see him getting that look that cops get when civilians try to tell them how to do their jobs. Polite on the surface, but definitely taking mental notes about who's being reasonable and who's being hysterical. When Tyler asked for identification to complete his report, Julia calmly provided her driver's license and federal contractor ID without any drama or resistance. But then she did something that completely changed the entire dynamic of this situation. She handed him her concealed carry permit. And not just any permit, but one with LEOSA endorsement. For those who don't know what that means, LEOSA stands for the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, which gives qualified federal law enforcement personnel the right to carry concealed weapons across state lines. It's not something you can just apply for online. It requires serious federal credentials and an ongoing law enforcement status. Tyler looked at the permit, looked at Julia, and I watched his entire demeanor shift in real time like someone had flipped a switch. "Ma'am," he said, his tone immediately becoming more respectful. "I didn't realize you held federal law enforcement status." This wasn't some dramatic movie salute or over-the-top recognition scene. This was simple professional courtesy between law enforcement officers. Tyler began addressing Julia with the appropriate respect due to someone with her credentials, asking about her federal contracting work and genuinely thanking her for her service to the country. The change in Tyler's tone was immediate and unmistakable, and Belinda's reaction was absolutely priceless. Her confident expression transformed from smug satisfaction to complete bewilderment faster than you could say federal authority. "What?" she called out from her yard, her voice cracking slightly. "She's just a neighbor. What authority does she have?" But Tyler continued his professional conversation with Julia, essentially treating Belinda's interruptions like background noise from a particularly annoying car alarm that everyone was trying to ignore. Watching Belinda's imaginary authority collapse in real time was honestly one of the most satisfying things I've ever witnessed in my entire life. Her precious clipboard, that symbol of her made-up power, slipped from her trembling hands and scattered papers across her perfectly manicured lawn like confetti at the world's most pathetic parade. She actually got down on her hands and knees in full view of the entire neighborhood, scrambling to collect her official-looking documents while Tyler continued showing Julia the professional courtesy that she actually deserved. "But I'm the HOA president," Belinda kept repeating, her voice climbing toward full hysteria like a siren reaching peak volume. "This is my community. I have authority here." Mrs. Carter, drawn by the commotion, had come outside with her morning coffee to watch this spectacular meltdown unfold. Other neighbors started emerging from their houses, too, sensing drama in the suburban air like sharks detecting blood in the water. The whole scene was turning into the kind of neighborhood spectacle that people would be talking about for years. Tyler's investigation was thorough and completely professional. He reviewed Julia's systematic documentation, timestamps, photographs, copies of those bogus violation notices against Belinda's increasingly emotional and contradictory claims. The contrast was absolutely stark. Julia had evidence, documentation, and calm professionalism, while Belinda had hysteria, interruptions, and what was clearly a fabricated victim narrative. When Tyler examined the supposed municipal code violations that Belinda had cited in her fake tickets, he couldn't find any such regulations in the county database. "Ma'am," Tyler told Belinda with growing skepticism and that particular cop tone that means someone's about to get a reality check. "Filing false police reports is a serious offense. Are you certain about these threat allegations?" The warning was crystal clear, and even Belinda seemed to realize she'd massively overplayed her hand. Her whole power fantasy was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane, and she was starting to understand that her fake authority meant absolutely nothing to actual law enforcement. As Tyler wrapped up his investigation, the entire community dynamic had shifted dramatically right before our eyes. Neighbors who had been afraid to approach us before were now coming over with curiosity and obvious respect. Mrs. Carter introduced herself properly and mentioned how she'd noticed problems with HOA's financial management that nobody had been willing to discuss. The young couple from 3 houses down actually apologized for not standing up to Belinda's previous harassment campaigns against other families. Even the teenagers on their bikes were looking at Julia with something approaching genuine awe. Tyler's final assessment was delivered with professional courtesy, but unmistakable clarity that left no room for interpretation. "This appears to be a civil HOA matter requiring proper legal channels," he told both parties. Though his tone when addressing Belinda carried a distinct warning that she'd better not waste his time again. "I strongly advise resolving disputes through appropriate procedures rather than emergency services." The message was perfectly clear. Don't call the police with manufactured drama and expect them to be your personal enforcement squad. As Tyler drove away, Belinda's public humiliation was absolutely complete. Every single neighbor had witnessed her authority being dismissed by actual law enforcement, while Julia received the professional respect that her federal credentials actually warranted. The woman who had terrorized our community with fake violations and imaginary legal threats had been exposed as a fraud in front of everyone she'd been trying to intimidate. That evening, as we debriefed over dinner, Julia admitted something that surprised me. "I was genuinely terrified this morning," she confessed. "Not of Belinda, but of what a police complaint could do to my security clearance. It was a sobering reminder that even when you are completely in the right, the system can still hurt you if you're not careful about how you handle things. But we dodged that bullet. And now we had something more valuable than just vindication. We had Tyler's professional assessment that Belinda's complaints were complete nonsense. The tables had turned completely, and Belinda definitely knew it. But that night, Julia spotted something that sent chills down both our spines. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Belinda was in her backyard burning papers in what looked like a small metal trash can. Julia tried to get a better view from our upstairs window, but as she watched, Belinda suddenly stopped and stared directly at Julia's window. How did she know Julia was watching? The morning after that creepy 2 a.m. staring contest between Julia and Belinda, I was officially convinced we were dealing with someone who'd either watched too many spy movies or was hiding something seriously illegal. But Julia's accounting brain was working overtime, connecting dots that I hadn't even noticed were there in the first place. "Marcus," she said over breakfast, stirring her coffee with that focused expression she gets when she's solving complex logistics problems. "Normal people don't burn documents at 2 in the morning unless they're hiding something major. And they definitely don't have the situational awareness to spot surveillance unless they're genuinely paranoid about being watched." That's when she decided to do what she does best: follow the money trail and see where it leads. Under California HOA law, specifically Civil Code 5200, which Julia had looked up because she's thorough like that, community members have the absolute legal right to inspect financial records. It's not a favor you ask for, it's a right you exercise. So, Julia submitted a formal written request for financial statements, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Just a straightforward exercise of her legal rights as a community member who pays dues and deserves to know where her money goes. Belinda's response was, well, let's just say it was more revealing than any financial document could have been. Instead of providing the documents within the required 15-day legal time frame, Belinda claimed they were being reviewed by our accountant, but somehow couldn't provide the accountant's name, firm, or any timeline for completion. When Julia politely asked for basic contact information so she could follow up directly, Belinda got defensive faster than a cornered animal. These documents contain confidential community information that requires careful review, she said, using that fake official tone that people adopt when they're making things up as they go along. Red flags don't get much redder than that, folks. Mrs. Carter became our unofficial neighborhood intelligence officer. And let me tell you, we never underestimate a retired accountant with time on her hands and a natural suspicion of financial irregularities. She came over with her phone full of photos that painted a disturbing picture of systematic neglect and broken promises. 3 years ago, they collected $8,000 in special assessments to repair the community playground, she explained, scrolling through before and after photos that looked identical. Look at this equipment. It's still broken, still dangerous, still exactly the same as it was when they collected our money. But that wasn't the worst part. Mrs. Carter had been keeping an informal track of HOA dues increases over the years because, as she put it, when you're on a fixed income, you notice when your bills keep going up. And the numbers were staggering, a 35% increase over 3 years, but the common areas actually looked worse now than when she'd moved here 5 years ago. Where did that money go? She asked. And honestly, it was a question that should have been asked a long time ago. The landscaping is dying. The mailboxes are falling apart. And don't even get me started on the state of our community entrance. Julia's investigative skills, honed by years of tracking military logistics and federal contractor budgets, started uncovering patterns that would have made a forensic accountant proud. Vendor contracts showed regular payments to something called Sunshine Maintenance LLC, $72,000 over 36 months for various community improvements that clearly hadn't happened. When Julia checked business registration databases, guess what she found? Absolutely nothing. No business license, no physical address, no legitimate corporate structure, no employee records. Just a shell company receiving regular electronic transfers from our HOA account like clockwork. Wire fraud, Julia muttered, scrolling through bank routing information with that intense focus she gets when she's tracking down discrepancies in federal contracts. Electronic transfers across state lines to a fake business entity. That's automatic federal jurisdiction. She was building a case that would make prosecutors drool. But I could see the wheels turning in her head about something bigger than just our neighborhood drama. This level of systematic fraud suggested someone with experience, someone who'd done this before and refined their methods. Meanwhile, Belinda's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic in ways that made both of us genuinely nervous about what she might do next. Anonymous threatening letters started appearing in our mailbox with messages like, "Military families bring unwanted federal scrutiny to peaceful communities," and "Some people learn to mind their own business the hard way." Nothing directly traceable to her, but the timing was suspiciously coincidental. She'd also hired some bargain basement lawyer with remaining HOA funds to send us a cease and desist letter about harassment of community leadership. The lawyer's letterhead looked like something printed at a 24-hour copy shop, which pretty much told us everything we needed to know about Belinda's legal strategy and budget. But then we got a breakthrough that changed everything we thought we knew about the situation. Julia found a manila envelope slipped under our door one morning containing bank statements and a handwritten note that made our blood run cold. "She's not the only one. Check Highland Oaks ID." And the documents inside showed a clear pattern: monthly transfers from our HOA maintenance account to Premium Care Manor, a memory care facility about 20 miles away. The amounts matched perfectly with the missing Sunshine maintenance payments, down to the penny. Someone was trying to help us understand Belinda's motivation, but the implications were staggering. This wasn't just petty theft or power-hungry corruption. This was a desperate daughter systematically stealing from her neighbors to keep her mother in specialized dementia care that cost $6,000 per month. Don't get me wrong, I'm not excusing criminal behavior, but suddenly her frantic desperation made horrible, heartbreaking sense. She was choosing between her mother's life and her neighbor's trust. And she decided that keeping her mother alive was worth destroying her community. Julia's military precision was building what prosecutors would later call one of the most thorough fraud cases they'd ever seen from a civilian complainant. She documented every fake violation, every threatening letter, every suspicious financial transfer with timestamps, photographs, and systematic organization that would have impressed federal investigators. The wire fraud evidence alone was enough to trigger a full-scale federal investigation. Electronic transfers to fictitious businesses across state lines, systematic embezzlement from a federally regulated community association, and mail fraud through fake invoices sent via postal service. "This isn't neighborhood drama anymore," Julia told me as she organized evidence files with the kind of methodical approach that made her so good at her federal contractor job. "This is organized crime with a $72,000 paper trail and enough federal violations to put someone in prison for decades." But even as she said it, I could see the conflict in her eyes. Exposing Belinda meant destroying not just a criminal, but a desperate woman trying to care for her dying mother. When Julia finally confronted Belinda at the mailbox with her preliminary findings, the reaction was immediate and genuinely terrifying. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Belinda hissed, her carefully maintained facade completely cracking to reveal the desperation underneath. "My mother will die if I can't pay for her care. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're destroying an innocent woman's life." The raw pain in her voice was heartbreaking, but it was also a confession that confirmed everything Julia had discovered. But Belinda's admission about her mother opened up questions that kept both of us awake that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything we'd learned. If she'd been successfully embezzling for 3 years without anyone noticing, why was she so aggressively targeting us specifically? Why not just ignore the new neighbors and continue her quiet theft? Unless she knew something was about to expose her anyway, and we'd simply arrived at the worst possible time. The next morning brought our answer in a way that was both enlightening and deeply disturbing. Julia found another manila envelope slipped under our door with more bank statements and a note that made everything click into place. "She's not the only one. Check Highland Oaks ID." But who left this and how do they know about Julia's investigation? The documents showed the same pattern of wire transfers to shell companies, the same systematic embezzlement techniques, the same desperate attempts to fund family medical care. We weren't dealing with one rogue HOA president having a breakdown. We were looking at what appeared to be a coordinated financial fraud operation spanning multiple communities. And somehow someone wanted us to discover the entire network. 3 days after Julia's mailbox confrontation with Belinda about the missing $72,000, our neighborhood drama took a turn that even my cynical mind didn't see coming. I woke up Tuesday morning to find "Military Go Home" spray-painted across Julia's car windshield in sloppy red letters, along with a note tucked under the wiper that read "Concerned Neighbors," in handwriting that looked suspiciously familiar. My first instinct was pure white-hot rage. I wanted to march over to Belinda's house and have a very direct conversation about property damage and intimidation tactics that would probably have involved some colorful military vocabulary. But Julia, ever the strategic thinker who sees 3 moves ahead while I'm still processing move 1, grabbed my arm and said something that stopped me dead in my tracks. "Marcus, look at this handwriting," she said, holding up the threatening note next to one of Belinda's violation letters. "Same slant, same letter formation, same pen pressure. This is definitely from our HOA president." The evidence was right there in black and white, or rather red spray paint and blue ink. But what we didn't know at the time was just how desperate and stupid Belinda had become in her attempts to drive us away. What we discovered later through police investigation was that Belinda had reached peak desperation the night before our car got vandalized. Premium Care Manor had issued a 48-hour eviction notice for her mother due to $18,000 in unpaid bills. Facing the immediate loss of her mother's specialized dementia care, Belinda had made a decision that would ultimately destroy not just her freedom, but any remaining shred of sympathy anyone might have had for her situation. Instead of vandalizing our car herself, which even she realized would be too obvious, she'd recruited 16-year-old Tyler from down the street. Young Tyler, probably thinking this was easy money for what seemed like a harmless prank, had been offered $50 cash for what Belinda described as teaching the military family a lesson about community respect. The kid had no idea he was being recruited into a federal crime by a desperate woman who was already facing wire fraud charges. Belinda had convinced him that military families think they're better than everyone else and needed to be knocked down a peg through some harmless vandalism that would just teach them to respect community standards. Tyler carried out his 2 a.m. mission with all the stealth and planning of a drunk elephant in a china shop. What he didn't know, what Belinda had somehow failed to research despite her paranoid behavior, was that Mrs. Carter had a hardwired security camera system installed after a break-in scare 2 years earlier. Not Wi-Fi cameras that could be jammed or disabled, but old-school wired surveillance that recorded everything directly to a digital storage system in her basement that had more backup redundancy than most corporate security systems. Every single step of Tyler's amateur vandalism operation was captured in high-definition color that would have made a documentary filmmaker proud. There he was, spray paint in hand, carefully writing his message while constantly looking over his shoulder like he expected the police to jump out from behind every bush. There was the note placement, the evidence staging, even a crystal-clear shot of him checking his phone, presumably for text messages from his employer giving him final instructions or encouragement. Mrs. Carter called us over that morning with barely contained excitement, like a detective who just solved the crime of the century. "You absolutely need to see this," she said, leading us down to her basement where multiple monitors displayed security footage from different angles around her property. "I've got everything. The whole thing is recorded from start to finish." But the footage that really made our jaws drop was from her second camera angle, which showed something that transformed this from simple vandalism into a conspiracy. At 2:15 a.m., roughly 10 minutes after Tyler finished his artistic masterpiece, a figure appeared at the edge of the camera's range. It was Belinda, dressed in dark clothing, checking Tyler's work and apparently giving him final instructions. The camera captured her handing him something, presumably his $50 payment, and then both of them disappearing in different directions like they'd rehearsed this whole operation. We had clear, undeniable evidence of conspiracy to commit vandalism. And Tyler was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between pranks and federal crimes. Officer Tyler, and yes, having two Tylers in the story is confusing, but that's real life for you, arrived within an hour of our call with that professional demeanor that told us he was taking this seriously. When confronted with video proof of his late-night activities, 16-year-old Tyler lasted approximately 3 minutes before completely breaking down in a way that made me feel genuinely bad for the kid. Mrs. Johnson said it was just a prank, he sobbed to his parents and the officer. She said military families think they're better than everyone and needed to be taught a lesson. She paid me $50 and said nothing bad would happen. The text message evidence on Tyler's phone was absolutely devastating for any defense Belinda might have tried to mount. Clear instructions about timing, location, what to write, and how to stage the evidence. It was all there in digital black and white. Most damning was a message sent at 1:45 a.m. Make sure the note looks authentic. We need them to think it's from angry neighbors. This wasn't some spontaneous act of teenage rebellion. This was a carefully coordinated conspiracy with a paper trail that even a first-year law student could follow to conviction. Tyler's confession to Officer Tyler included details about previous jobs that Belinda had hired him for, including delivering mysterious packages to other neighborhoods at odd hours and taking photos of specific houses for reasons he'd never understood. The scope of Belinda's activities was becoming clear. She'd been running some kind of operation that extended far beyond our little subdivision, and our teenage vandal was just the latest recruit in what was apparently a systematic campaign of neighborhood intimidation. The community reaction was swift and absolutely brutal for Belinda's remaining reputation. Mrs. Carter, bless her heart, had shared the security footage in our neighborhood chat group before we could even ask her to be discreet about it. Within hours, every single household in our subdivision had seen clear high-definition evidence of their HOA president hiring teenagers to commit crimes against military families. The same neighbors who had been afraid to challenge Belinda's authority were now posting comments expressing shock, disgust, and demands for her immediate resignation. But the most telling reaction came from Belinda herself, and it was honestly more disturbing than anything she'd done so far. When Tyler and his parents went to her house to confess his involvement and apologize, expecting her to take responsibility for hiring him, She denied everything with the kind of righteous indignation that would have been impressive if it wasn't so obviously fake. Standing on her front porch in broad daylight, with half the neighborhood watching from their windows, she told Tyler's parents that their son was obviously lying to avoid consequences for his own criminal behavior. "I would never engage in such activities," she declared with theatrical outrage that belonged on a soap opera stage. "Your son is clearly trying to shift blame for his own poor choices onto a respected community leader." The audacity was breathtaking, really. Here was someone caught red-handed on security footage, with text message evidence, facing a teenager's detailed confession, and she was still trying to maintain her victim narrative while throwing a 16-year-old kid under the bus. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was standing room only, the first time in years that community members had shown up in significant numbers to challenge Belinda's leadership. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and suspicious financial practices that they'd been too afraid to discuss before. The maintenance worker testified about being told to inflate invoices. The former treasurer admitted to being pressured into resigning after questioning expense reports. Even families who'd moved away sent written statements about Belinda's systematic abuse of power that painted a picture of years of corruption. When the vote came to remove Belinda from her position as HOA president, it was unanimous, 37 households voting for her immediate removal, with only one abstention from a family that was out of town. But Belinda's response to this complete community rejection was perhaps the most disturbing thing we'd witnessed in this entire ordeal. Instead of anger, instead of shame, instead of any normal human emotion you'd expect from someone whose criminal behavior had just been exposed to their entire community, Belinda smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sarcastic smile, but a genuinely pleased expression that sent chills down every spine in that room. What does she know that the rest of them don't? The morning after Belinda's removal from the HOA presidency brought a sight that will be burned into my memory forever. Two black SUVs with federal license plates parked outside our subdivision entrance, and agents in those unmistakable FBI windbreakers walking purposefully through our neighborhood like they owned the place. Mrs. Carter had been absolutely right to suspect something bigger was happening here. This wasn't just about our local HOA drama anymore. This was about a federal investigation that had been building for months, and our quiet little suburban community had just become a crucial piece in their puzzle. Agent Smith from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit approached our house with the kind of professional demeanor that immediately tells you this is serious business. Not neighborhood gossip or local politics, but actual federal law enforcement with real consequences. "Mrs. Julia," he said, showing his credentials with practiced efficiency. "Your complaint about wire fraud is connected to several ongoing investigations we've been conducting. We've been tracking a network of HOA embezzlement schemes across 3 counties, and your documentation is honestly some of the best evidence we've seen." Apparently, Julia's military precision in building her case had provided exactly the kind of systematic proof that federal prosecutors need to make charges stick in court. The search warrant execution at Belinda's house was a neighborhood spectacle that drew every single resident to their windows and front yards like we were watching the season finale of our favorite crime drama. FBI agents spent 6 hours systematically cataloging evidence: computers, phones, financial documents, even boxes of papers that Belinda had apparently been storing in her garage like some kind of criminal archivist. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who had been so paranoid about destroying evidence had kept detailed records of her own crimes. "Criminals always think they're smarter than they actually are," Agent Smith explained as we watched the evidence collection process. She documented everything because she wanted to track exactly how much she was stealing and from where. But the real shock came when Agent Smith shared the scope of what they discovered through months of investigation that had been happening parallel to our neighborhood drama. Highland Oaks HOA, the community mentioned in our mysterious anonymous tip, was indeed part of the same criminal network. So were Meadowbrook Estates and Riverside Commons. 4 different communities, 4 different HOA presidents, all using the exact same shell company structure to embezzle maintenance funds with military precision. The total amount stolen wasn't just our $72,000. It was over $300,000 across multiple jurisdictions spanning 3 counties. The family connection that Agent Smith revealed made everything click into place in the most disturbing way possible, like puzzle pieces forming a picture that you really didn't want to see completed. Belinda's sister Margaret was the HOA president at Highland Oaks, where identical wire fraud had been occurring for 2 years using the same fake vendor system. Their cousin ran the financial books at Meadowbrook Estates, handling the money transfers and shell company management. What we'd assumed was one desperate woman stealing to pay for her mother's dementia care was actually an organized family business of systematically defrauding suburban communities. The anonymous tips, the mysterious evidence deliveries, the way Belinda seemed to anticipate our investigation before we'd even started it, everything was connected to a criminal network that was much larger and more sophisticated than any of us had imagined in our worst nightmares. Your neighborhood wasn't randomly targeted, Agent Smith explained as we watched federal agents carry boxes of evidence out of Belinda's house. You were specifically chosen because your wife's federal contractor background made you likely to notice financial irregularities. They were testing their methods against professional scrutiny. Belinda's arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after everything we'd been through over the past few weeks. She answered the door at 6 a.m. in her bathrobe, looking like someone who had been expecting this exact moment for weeks and had already mentally prepared herself for federal custody. No dramatic resistance, no tearful breakdown, no last-minute attempts to flee or destroy evidence. Just resigned acceptance as federal agents read her rights and walked her to their unmarked vehicle like this was just another Tuesday morning appointment. The only emotion she showed during the entire arrest process was when Agent Smith mentioned her mother's care facility situation. "She'll be taken care of," Belinda said quietly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of relief and sadness. That was always the plan. Even facing federal charges that could put her in prison for decades, her primary concern was still her mother's well-being, which would have been touching if it wasn't so completely twisted by the criminal methods she'd used to fund that care. Mrs. Carter had one more crucial piece of information that explained Belinda's bizarre behavior over the past few weeks, particularly her strange satisfaction at being voted out of the HOA presidency. "I saw her loading suitcases at 3 a.m. 2 nights ago," she told Agent Smith during his neighborhood interviews. "But her car never moved from the driveway, and I watched until sunrise." The FBI discovered that Belinda's sister, Margaret, had been planning to pick her up for what they called the exit strategy, fleeing to Margaret's remote cabin in Oregon while federal heat died down and evidence trails went cold. The suitcases that Mrs. Carter had observed contained cash, backup identification documents, prepaid cell phones, and enough supplies for an extended disappearance from civilization. Margaret had been coordinating escape plans for the entire family network with specific protocols for who would flee when law enforcement finally caught up to their operation. But Belinda's car was still in the driveway. So where was she planning to go? The answer revealed just how sophisticated this criminal enterprise had become. The cooperation deal that Belinda ultimately accepted revealed the true scope of what we'd accidentally stumbled into by simply asking for HOA's financial records. This wasn't just about 4 HOA communities being systematically robbed by family members. This was about a carefully researched approach to targeting suburban associations with weak financial oversight and aging volunteer leadership. The Johnson family had spent years perfecting a method of infiltrating HOA boards, establishing fake vendor relationships, and systematically draining maintenance funds while appearing to be model community leaders. Agent Smith pulled Julia aside during one of their evidence review sessions to share something that sent chills down both our spines and made us realize how deep this rabbit hole actually went. "Your case opened something much bigger than we initially realized," he said, his expression serious in that way that federal agents get when they're about to share classified information. "We need to talk about Highland Oaks HOA and what we found there. And we especially need to discuss Belinda's sister Margaret, her sister. What does family have to do with federal wire fraud?" The answer, as it turned out, was absolutely everything we hadn't understood about this situation. Margaret had been the mastermind coordinating the entire network from her position as HOA president in Highland Oaks, using family connections and shared financial resources to expand their criminal enterprise across multiple counties. She'd been feeding Belinda information about our investigation, using her own network of compromised HOA officials to monitor federal inquiry patterns and stay ahead of law enforcement surveillance. Our neighborhood hadn't been randomly targeted. We'd been carefully selected as a test case for whether their methods could survive investigation by someone with Julia's federal background. The most chilling discovery came when federal investigators revealed that Margaret had been maintaining detailed profiles of over 200 HOA communities across 6 states, complete with financial analysis, leadership vulnerabilities, and operational timelines for potential infiltration. The Johnson family hadn't just been running a regional embezzlement scheme. They'd been developing a systematic approach for nationwide expansion of suburban community fraud, treating HOA theft like a legitimate business enterprise with market research and growth strategies. The final twist in Belinda's cooperation came when she revealed the identity of our anonymous tip provider, her own nephew, who'd grown uncomfortable with the family's criminal activities and had been secretly feeding information to potential victims through those manila envelopes. His conscience had ultimately brought down the entire operation, but the scope of what they'd been planning was staggering. Federal investigators found evidence of expansion plans that could have victimized thousands of families across the entire southwestern United States. As we left the federal courthouse after Belinda's sentencing, Julia and I both felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and genuine sadness. Justice had been served, our community was healing, and a major criminal network had been exposed and prosecuted. But seeing someone's life completely destroyed, even someone who had made terrible choices that hurt innocent people, reminded us that real-world consequences are messier and more painful than the clean resolutions you see in movies. During the plea hearing, Agent Smith pulls Julia aside. "Your case opens something much bigger. We need to talk about Highland Oaks HOA and Belinda's sister, her sister. What does family have to do with federal wire fraud?" That question would lead to revelations about a criminal network spanning multiple states and potentially hundreds of targeted communities. 18 months after Belinda's sentencing, our neighborhood had transformed in ways that none of us could have predicted during those initial confrontations over fake HOA violations. The fear and intimidation that had characterized community life under Belinda's reign of clipboard terror had been completely replaced by genuine cooperation and mutual support. Property values had increased by 8% as word spread that our HOA had implemented some of the most transparent financial oversight practices in the county. Families were staying instead of fleeing, and new residents were specifically choosing our community because of our reputation for accountability and honest governance. Mrs. Carter had proven to be exactly the kind of leader our community needed, someone with genuine financial expertise, zero tolerance for corruption, and enough life experience to spot manipulation tactics before they could take root. Her monthly financial reports were models of clarity, showing exactly where every dollar went and why every expenditure was necessary. The quarterly member meetings that had been sparsely attended during Belinda's tenure were now standing-room-only affairs where residents actively participated in budget discussions and community planning like actual engaged citizens. Julia's professional reputation had continued to benefit from her handling of the federal investigation. Her documentation methods and cooperation with law enforcement had become a case study used in federal contractor training programs, illustrating how military personnel can properly navigate civilian criminal matters while maintaining security clearance requirements. She'd been promoted to senior logistics coordinator and had taken on additional responsibilities advising other military families about community integration and civilian leadership opportunities. The healing process hadn't been without challenges. Some residents had initially been uncomfortable with the federal attention our community received during the investigation, and a few families had moved away rather than deal with media coverage and ongoing legal proceedings. The financial recovery had been only partial. Insurance covered most of the stolen funds, but our community had still absorbed losses that affected planned improvements and emergency reserves. Trust rebuilding took time, and some neighbors remained cautious about HOA involvement even under new leadership. The greatest change was how conflicts were resolved. Belinda's fear-based rule was replaced by open communication and mediation. Noise, parking, and maintenance disputes became opportunities for compromise, not harassment. Families could improve their homes without intimidation, and children played freely without constant complaints. The annual barbecue organized by Mrs. Carter turned into a true celebration of resilience, where neighbors discussed real goals, transparency, and accountability rather than empty small talk. Captain Hayes's family moved in 6 months earlier, perfectly reflecting Julia's vision of integrating military families. His daughter joined the high school robotics team, funded by recovered HOA money, while his son enjoyed safe playgrounds finally repaired with embezzled funds. The contrast to Belinda's hostility toward military families was striking. Julia often reflected on how different things could have been. "We could have signed her covenant and avoided the drama," she said during a walk, "but she'd still be stealing, intimidating, destroying trust." By resisting, our neighborhood not only exposed corruption but helped federal investigators protect dozens of other communities targeted by the Johnson network. Federal interest remained strong even after Belinda's sentencing. Agent Smith consulted Julia about fraud patterns, her documentation now training investigators nationwide. At one barbecue, a woman quietly introduced herself. "I'm Detective Hayes. My mother lives in Highland Oaks, the HOA you helped investigate." She handed Julia a card. "We found something in Belinda's sister's house, something that connects to your neighborhood." The conversation revealed Margaret Johnson had been keeping detailed records on potential fraud targets across the Southwest. Our community was part of a much larger project identifying HOA associations with weak oversight and aging leadership. The Johnson family wasn't just running a regional embezzlement scheme. They developed a systematic plan for nationwide expansion of suburban community fraud. Detective Hayes explained federal investigators had found profiles of more than 200 HOA communities across 6 states, complete with financial analysis, leadership vulnerabilities, and operational timelines. Their sophistication was staggering. They treated HOA fraud like a business enterprise with market research, expansion strategies, and operating protocols designed to support a criminal network across the country. The most disturbing discovery was that our neighborhood wasn't chosen at random. Julia's federal contractor background made us a deliberate target, a testing ground to see if their methods could withstand professional scrutiny. They specifically selected communities with military families and federal employees to refine techniques under tougher oversight. As Hayes shared these revelations during our community barbecue, I realized our suburban drama had been part of something far larger and more dangerous. The clipboard-wielding president who terrorized us had been running field research for a network that could have victimized thousands. By resisting instead of complying, we had accidentally prevented a massive expansion of organized fraud. That night, children played safely, families laughed, and neighbors planned improvements. Then a woman approached Julia. "I'm Detective Hayes. My mother lives in Highland Oaks, the HOA you helped investigate. We found something in Belinda's sister's house, something that connects to your neighborhood." And that's how one HOA Karen's fake authority sparked a federal investigation that protected communities nationwide. If this story of military precision versus suburban corruption kept you hooked, smash that like button. I'm your host at The Silent Brave, and I'll see you in the next incredible tale of justice served. Until then, stay strong and never back down from doing what's right.